Thank you. A brief moment about the history of the Center. For a long time, we've been interested in the issue of what is organizational effectiveness, what defines an effective organization. And now for several decades, we've adopted something that we call a quadruple bottom line in contrast to the triple bottom line, because we felt that the triple bottom line thinking didn't give enough attention to how the members of an organization are treated. And they get lumped in under the social impact, and perhaps both of those get minor attention relative to the financial and perhaps the environmental. So what we mean by the quadruple line is as shown, I think, by the PowerPoint that's up there now. That is, yes, financial performance, environmental performance, social performance outside the environment, outside the organization, excuse me, and how members are treated by the organization. And our argument is that an effective organization does all four of those well, and it uses management approaches which balance and integrate the outcomes in all four of those areas. Not a simple challenge, and I think it's clearly something that organizations may aspire to, but take decades to perfect and develop. Some are more developed certainly at this point than others, and in this session we want to talk about some of the things they do that produce a positive quadruple bottom line impact. Certainly a key issue is the management approach that they take, and again, carrying next, yeah. Again, it's a way to simplify it is to take the traditional view that yes, profits above all else, and certainly some economists for decades have said that's really how corporations can do the best possible thing for all of us, that is maximize profits. Obviously, that's not been our model. We've argued for a long time that it needs to be a balance, certainly at least between the financial and the social environmental, and perhaps taking more of a corporate stewardship role, which, as you'll see in this session, goes beyond just saying you want to manage the quadruple bottom line. You want to do it in ways that is responsive to all four of those and doesn't automatically put one above the others. I'm going to turn it over to Sue because she's done most of the work really in the center on the stewardship approach and begin to outline what we think about there and what that looks like. Sue?
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to those of you on the line. And Carrie, it is not moving forward for me. I don't know if you've passed the controls to me or not. Carrie?
I did. I just moved it ahead one for you, and I'm going to hand it back to you. You can see if it's not going to work, I'll do it.
Yeah, you know what's happened? I think mine has frozen, so I'm going to need for you to move slides forward for me.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah, okay. All right. Sorry, guys. I was working just fine earlier. I don't understand this. Okay, so we're on definitions of sustainability, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So as Ed said, I've sort of been the leader of our set of studies. Chris Worley has been my partner in this, and at times a number of other people from CEO have been members of the team. And we have worked with a consortium of universities and a consortium of companies and organizations of all types, but mostly companies, that are interested in this area. And the way we have proceeded is to pull together conferences and really talk about what companies are doing, what they're facing, what their challenges are, what their approaches are, what's working, what isn't working. And as academics, we've been creating a set of rich case studies and also pulling out common themes across them. So if you're wondering where the information that we're going to provide in this webinar comes from, that's where it comes from, as well as from some of our academic colleagues who have written on specific topics, and we'll be talking about that. We all started at least a decade ago, and for some of us longer than that, with the definition that was generated by the UN when it came up with its global sustainable development objectives. And that was way back in 1983, a commission that has been since known as the Brundtland Commission because of the leader of the task team, defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future organizations and generations to meet their own needs. And it focuses on improving the lives of people and the conditions of the planet while building enterprises that are sustained by solid financials and profitability. And I think it's really important to note that even back in 1983, the UN identified very clearly that economic enterprise was going to have to be central to, if not the central actor in creating a sustainably developed Earth and world for us to live in. Carrie, if you can move it forward, that'd be great. Carrie?
Yeah, it's moved. Sue, is your screen frozen?
I have no idea. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to, I can move down at the same time you move down. Apologies to the audience for this. It was working fine until we started this.
The audience's fault. When they weren't there, it worked fine.
Yeah, so that would have been a good time to watch it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This slide shows what's happened since 1983. And I think it's really sobering to look at this. In the purple center, it really shows the things that have changed in what corporations have to deal with, one of which is environmentalism. It tends to be the one we hear the most about, and we tend to hear particularly about climate change and greenhouse gas impact. There is also a substantial amount of work on resource shortages, just plain as the environment able to house and feed and nurture the population of human beings that are living on it and also living within the current way that our economy and our organizations and societies are organized. At the same time, it's become very closely linked to the social justice advocacy issues in the world. Probably the one we hear the most about now is the inequities in the distribution of wealth, at least the unevenness in the distribution of wealth, depending upon what perspective you come from. And the blurring of the public and private and civil roles has become quite important to how companies operate, given, one, that companies can no longer expect that corporations will deal with the externalities, the impacts that they have on their society. Companies can no longer expect that that's the role of government to clean that up, that government should be enticing them to do business in their area and providing the services they need to do business in their area and dealing with the aftermath of doing business in the area and potentially even shutting down business in the area and moving on. And that ethic prevailed for a long time and has become one that is no longer sustainable, given that almost every, even the developed world, almost every government is finding itself short of the capacity to fund those kinds of externalities, let alone the inherent social net that is required for society to exist, the inherent infrastructure building and other services that are clearly government services. So something has to give somewhere in terms of who really foots the bill and who takes responsibility for the sustainability issues. And around all of that, and loosely related but also tightly related in the sense that it impacts companies, is the geopolitical uncertainty. Whereas a lot of the unrest in the world, it's hard to say corporations have caused it, but certainly corporations are having to deal with the impact of the social unrest and the conflagrations, really, that are having huge impact on the world as a whole, including creating huge uncertainty in highly developed nations. So if we go to the next slide, I think my hope for all this is that we've stopped what was really 25 years of denying that these problems exist. And I think in the last 10 years, and especially the last few years, we're making great headway in saying, okay, they exist, let's stop arguing about who caused what, and let's start saying, what do we all need to do together to move forward and deal with some of these issues. And I hope I made it clear that I think one of the reasons that corporations need to get on board with this, and in many cases are taking a true leadership role in it, is that those changes to the way corporations operate have potentially huge impact on their viability and their sustainability through time. And corporations, in order to be healthy, need a healthy context in which to operate. So even a pragmatist would say that it's really critical that enterprises, corporations, take the lead in this. And I think we're starting to see some real agreement, particularly with respect to climate change, but in other areas as well. The UN Brundtland Commission was followed up by the 2015 Global Agenda, which is an even more aggressive set of objectives for sustainable development for the world that takes into account a lot of these social, geopolitical kinds of issues, a lot of the justice issues, as well as front and center is the resource issue and the global warming issue. And it was headed up and largely formulated by leaders from very prominent corporations, Paul Pullman of Unilever being the actual head of this commission that came out with this global agenda, and is now providing the framework for a lot of cross-sectional kinds of initiatives and task teaming and action planning. The International Energy Agency's 2015 report was one voice among many, but a very critical voice in saying a lot has been done in terms of climate and energy management in the world, but it actually hasn't slowed down the acceleration of the problem, particularly with respect to global warming, nor can it reverse the acceleration of the problem of resource shortage if you project forward through this century and look at the consumption of resources, not just oil, but almost all natural resources that we all depend upon, and corporations are no exception to that. The World Economic Forum, which is the major corporations internationally, of course, has their set of global risks and hasn't changed a whole lot. And it takes into account almost all the things that were in that previous chart around social inequities, around climate change, around the problems that are caused by geopolitical uncertainty, and so forth. And these are risks. These are risks that they self-rate, companies rate, as having potentially very destabilizing impact on their ability as a corporation to operate. So there's clearly awareness in the C-suite that this is an issue. And then we've, of course, got the Pope weighing in with his Laudato Si and really turning this into, in some positions, a moral and ethical discussion about what do we owe to the future and to each other on this planet, and what do we need to think about in terms of looking at the way the global economy is operating if we're going to create a sustainable world. Even the billionaires have spoken. An article in the New York Times quoted 10 or 15 of the richest people in the world, many of whom we recognize from our major corporations, saying, this is just a time bomb. And whereas we have all benefited from it and admit that, we have all got to, we being the billionaires, we've got to be part of the solution as well, and look at what have we done in terms of the consumption of resources, but even more important in terms of contributing to inequities in the world and potential social unrest. And then we've got the Paris Agreement with 195 nations agreeing, at least in principle, to radically change their greenhouse gas emissions and their impact on global warming, and a reviewable and they think enforceable, although everyone says there's really no enforcement provisions in it, way of tracking that into the next 6 years at least. And that came out about the same time as the Economist Intelligentsia report on the impact of global warming, and basically it predicts that if we don't cut down to 2 degrees centigrade increase, and if we head towards the 5 degrees that we're right now headed towards, it could cut as much as 30% out of the net worth of assets in the world. a very rigorous analysis. So I think the consensus is there. So what is the responsibility of a corporation, given all of that? And in the book that we edited, which I'll talk about in a minute, and to tell you sort of the breadth of issues that were dealt with in that book, the definition we used was that it's companies operating to be simultaneously profitable, ethical, and socially and environmentally responsible. And that it involves the careful management of resources, all resources, including employees, including the impact on humanity and communities, including natural resources, including financial resources, and an attitude that these are held in trust so that they're left in better condition for use by future generations. That really is the definition that is starting to emerge to define the domain of responsibility. The next page is the cover from our book, and it came from a conference that we had, first a public conference in which a number of CEOs, including Starbucks and Costco and Gore and 5 or 6 other companies were represented, talked about what they're feeling is their responsibility and their increasing understanding of the depth of that responsibility and what they're doing about it. It was followed by a day-long with about 15 academics, each of whom has been working in this area with companies to try to understand how things can move forward with the explicit goal of both understanding and helping to accelerate the changes that it will be needed. So if we go to the next slide, one of the focuses of that book was on leadership and ethics. And we've placed a lot of stock in the world on leadership and on very, very prominent leaders having influence not only on what their companies do and establishing a leadership role, but also setting an example and being part of global kinds of forums that are discussing and getting common understanding about how to move forward. And what keeps being mentioned about the leaders is their central role in building a responsible and ethical culture, knowing that what the leader says and does in public forums has to actually line up with how they lead their organization so that other people in the organization have a similar set of objectives and a similar set of values and culture that's framing their decisions and their actions and their understanding of what they're trying to optimize and foster as they go about their work beyond just simply a financial perspective and looking out at that quadruple bottom line. A concept that has emerged and that's talked about by the leadership scholars in the book in particular is the concept of shared value, which is the alignment of stakeholders, not just shareholders, as the primary recipients of the value that's provided by a corporation. And the definition of that stakeholder word fairly broadly to include the people in the community, the people who work in the organization. Many of the scholars who think about shared value think about the earth itself and the natural systems of the earth as an unspeaking stakeholder, but one nonetheless if we look at the future of humanity. And then there's an increasing emphasis, and many of you may have been to internal and external meetings that are looking at how do we actually infuse values and meaning into organizations? What's the role of the leader, and what kinds of processes are needed to infuse that? And these are all discussed in the book, but also we would say that they're one of the major things that is happening in the companies we work with in order to create a stewardship perspective on the corporation's role. The next slide looks at another critical issue, which many of you may be aware of, which is how do you actually get an organizational strategy to be aligned with this much broader perspective on why the corporation exists. And we drew heavily on the work of Chris Laszlo, who's been working in this space for a while and has contributed to our knowledge as well. And he describes really 5 ways that companies do this, and I'm not going to go into depth, but it starts with sort of a bolt-on strategy where companies say, yes, I am polluting the atmosphere, or yes, there are sweatshops in Southeast Asia that we need to attend to because of our commitment to human rights, and comes up with initiatives, and they tend to be at first bolted on to what the company is doing in its, quote, mainstream economic way of operating, and then the companies start to say, we really need to embed this. We need to build it in to the goals and the objectives of everyone in the organization. We need to look at the functioning of every part of the organization, and is it aligned with a sustainable stewardship orientation or not, and not just how can we make money from doing things that are sustainable. So a company like GE may have started with its eco-imagination by saying, we want to produce products that contribute to a sustainable world. So we're going to work on large systems products that use less energy, that are more affordable to people in the developing world, and so forth. And we know we can make money by doing that because there's a huge pull for that in the society. We know we can make money by having a zero-emissions plant because so much waste is saved in that kind of an environment. But then how do we build that in so that that way of thinking about why we're here? We're here to reduce the negative footprint in the world, and not so much because it's a financially viable strategy. We want it to be that, but we want it to be its own strategy integrated with the full quadruple bottom line as well, and embedded in all parts of the organization. And then the other thing Chris talks about is the need to go from the incremental change, and he would even define a zero-emissions plant as incremental change. It changes for the good. There's no question all plants should become zero emissions, but he would say that the radical innovation will really change the whole notion of what you're making, how you're making it, the recyclability of it, the sharing of it, so that not only are you manufacturing in a way that is sustainable, but you are also decreasing the load on the resources of the earth, and that requires radical innovation. Doing less harm to net positive impact is another of these themes, and you've got companies like Kingfisher, a British company that does home improvements, that has a plan in place, a full-bore strategy to by 2050 being a net positive contributor rather than a net positive exploiter of the resources of the earth, and of the net positive contributor to solving the problems of the earth. And it includes things like an approach to helping people, instead of buying new things and using them, mend them and repair them and sell them through selling them material goods that can be loaned and shared and things like that. So we see a lot of that starting to crop up. Kingfisher is just one nice example, because they're also doing the other pieces of this that what we're going to be talking about organizational redesign. Many of the initial elements of sustainability and stewardship really focused on things that were most immediately available to the affluent, whether it's because they focused on developed nations or whether it's because they focused on products like the Tesla that only the affluent can buy, but everyone in the world would agree is ecologically sound, but who can afford it? There is even a lot of work being done to how do you do things like turn farmers markets, which tend to have higher prices than a supermarket, into a marketplace in which everyone can afford to come and buy, not just those who are able to say, I'm willing to spend 20 to 25% more for my product, and that's why I go to farmers markets, to get the freshest, tastiest thing. but how do you make that actually available to the food deserts of inner cities that don't even have access to supermarkets, let alone to a farmer market product? And that's just a microcosm of the whole bigger issue of if we're doing a lot of things in the developed world where people can afford them, how do we actually make those same kinds of advances available in the developing world to populations that are trying to actually become, move out of the poverty level. And right here in our cities, many people in the book comment that if we've got 25% of people in our inner cities in the U.S. who are living below the poverty line, we probably haven't actually created a sustainable society if you say that a sustainable society is one that actually is sustainable in terms of the entire population. And if we've got the working poor constituting a very large percentage of our workforce, and they're still below the poverty line, we probably haven't created organizations that are contributing to sustainable communities. And then the last thing that was really a common strategy topic, and we found this in our own research, is that a lot of stewardship sustainability initiatives tend to be embarked on as pilots, and often it's very hard to scale them up. And so there's a lot of discussion of how do you think about these changes, not as pilots, but as learning activities that with the goal of being a fully scaled up, more sustainable way of doing things. So there's been an evolution in how you think about strategy, long and short, from initiatives to get us in compliance and to get us good public relations and in some cases to save us money, to initiatives to actually address a different set of outcomes than we have addressed historically. If you go to the next slide, the blue part really just repeats that the Holy Grail has been to get away from the periphery and into the core of how the organization is designed. And this slide is meant to make the point that is where CEO has really done all of our research, which is you can only do this if you redesign some major elements of the organization, including how decisions are made and what criteria are used to evaluate decisions, reporting relationships so that the people who worry about stewardship are not on a peripheral role in the organization, structures that connect the full value stream, goals and objectives that include stewardship outcomes in the objectives of every unit and of the company as a whole and of the corporate executives, employee accountabilities that include making decisions and doing work in a way that's sustainable and improving sustainability, and rewards for said outcomes. Chris Worley and I in our research have found that there's a key set of elements in sustainability transitions. Stewardship transitions could be used just as well in this chart, and it actually is pretty much in the chronological order that we have looked at in upwards of 35 cases of companies that are really making this transition with a lot of energy. So we've got first embracing the problem, and as I mentioned, it's taken us a very long time as a society and a community of corporations to truly embrace the problem and see it as something other than, yeah, we'll clean up that footprint or we'll clean up that footprint. And then actually infuse a values framework that can guide the activities. And we see companies starting to have all kinds of, in some cases, social media mediated forums for people in the company to come together to generate a values framework. In other cases, it's the executives working with key stakeholders, maybe perhaps customers and partners and so forth, to come up with a values framework. The mission and purpose and its connection to the strategy get articulated, and that provides the overarching framework for aligning the parts of the organization with it, including organizing that breaks down the barriers so that sustainability isn't just the responsibility of those who manufacture or those who run plants in other parts of the world that need to get in human rights. They need to raise themselves up in that frontier. It's actually the responsibility all the way to how do we design our products so that we're responsible users, consumers of resources, so that it meets needs of the communities and the earth to be sustainable and to rise out of poverty and to have communities that where people feel that they have a chance and opportunity and aren't out demonstrating on the streets, to how we connect with our customers and how we connect with their values and what they would like to see us deliver for them. So it's the entire value stream, and working across that value stream in our studies has required a lot of cross-functional activity and very well-supported cross-functional activity where the objectives of the cross-functional units actually become the objectives of the entire organization. Addressing the full value stream is sort of the outcome of that. Most interesting to us right now is that most companies have discovered very quickly that they can't do this from within a company. And in fact, one of the key scholars, or several of the key scholars in this area, Andy Hoffman at Michigan, has a really good set of research that says you can improve the sustainability of any corporation, and actually you can make a small impact on overall sustainability, but that the real progress is made through interorganizational combinations that actually connect the players in the global economy much differently. We've already learned that around economic outcomes. Now it's a question of putting that to work around the stewardship outcomes that we're looking at. So a lot of emphasis on action networks. And then the icing on the cake is how do we report? To whom do we report? Are we transparent? Do we have an integrated, transparent set of reporting items such as are advocated by the UN and are described in great detail by Bob Eccles and others at Harvard who say, here's how you do it and here's what you benefit from by doing that way, not only in terms of the quadruple bottom line, but in terms of your financial outcome as a part of that quadruple bottom line. And they make the case that if you don't have that transparency, that ability to connect all these outcomes, you lose sight of the fact that by dealing with the full set of outcomes, you're actually, the whole boat is rising in higher waters. You aren't doing it at the expense of financials. And you also lose the ability to plan in a way that you ensure that all four of the outcomes are addressed. And then one of the things that evolves from all these changes through experience, through planning, through being part of values definition, is you end up with a set of leaders and employees who operate as if stewardship is their core responsibility, not an add-on responsibility. So that's something that the CEO writings and has really focused on, is that transition. If you look at the next page, it's 4 phases of the transition that we have tracked in almost every company. Compliance to whatever is being required, trying out new approaches and learning, that's the piloting, that's the initiative stage, integrating into the way the organization is run, and then integrating into the much larger ecosystem through reaching out and connecting with other companies. Many of your companies probably are involved in these. One example from the Kingfisher example that I mentioned, the home improvement company, is the Timber Retail Coalition that has Kingfisher, Carrefour, IKEA, Marks & Spencer, and has a number of very prominent NGOs, non-governmental organizations, such as the Forest Stewardship Council, and they're really working on plans to impact the overall forestation in the world through a very large consortium and action network of organizations that work with governments and NGOs and local populations to try to make sure that we have forests in the future. And as their CEO says, we can't do this alone. We can have a small impact if we say we're only going to use renewable raw materials. but we can have a big impact if we join together and say, if there aren't forests in the world, none of us are going to exist. And so this is a matter of business, and this is a matter of the survival for the people who follow us through into the next generations, as well as for us. The next slide shows all the components of Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan, and this has emerged over about an 8 to 10-year transition and become more and more well-defined. I am not going to read this to you. If you're interested and get the slides, you can look at it. But I just want to point out that it is very comprehensive. It starts with the abandoning of the short-term reporting of profitability and financials, saying that all that does is it takes us away from creating a truly viable, sustainable business. And they were one of the first, and now there are many who are following, to refuse to have those quarterly analyst calls. They look at their products. They look at things like gender parity. They look at water and energy and other natural resources, such as palm oil, and how do you get sustainable either palm oil forests or how do you get a replacement for palm oil. They look at managing by rules and principles rather than by by principles rather than by rules and measures only. Holistic corporate strategies. I mean, there is a very broad set of values and plans that they hold their executives, their managers, and their employees accountable for operating within. And they report on progress against this and on goals against it in a very transparent and public manner. And I think this is a poster child for what many companies are starting to do. And that kind of transparency and that kind of commitment will be absolutely required. We go to the next slide. Just the final point I want to make before I turn it over to Ed to talk about the role of human resources is a very, very strong message in our conference, both of academics and of the corporate leaders, was that we have to sort of step back and say, our faith that we can use modern technology and engineer our way out of the mess that we're in is probably ill-founded. Yes, we need modern technology and we need engineering capabilities. We need new business models, et cetera. And we need new organizations that are designed differently. But we can't actually operate differently if we don't change our aspirations and our assumptions. The UN's objectives, the concept of stewardship, is really, it is a basic fundamental values perspective. And what we know is that if people don't start to value this and internalize it, everything becomes compliance to new stretch goals of some sort. And the results are just not good when that is what's driving stewardship activities. You can reduce the non-sustainability, but you can't optimize sustainability. So some of the values that just kept coming up over and over again, these are just examples. Again, I won't read them all, but that whole notion of shared value, not shareholder value, not solely shareholder value. I think everybody in this who works in this area understands without shareholders, without capital, you can't do any of this. But basically what's being said is if that's what you focus on optimizing and you aren't also focusing on optimizing the other three pillars, then what you get is the distortion that we have right now in terms of who benefits and how from the activities of corporations. So protecting the earth and its people rather than exploiting comes out a lot. Collaboration comes out a lot. Collaborating around different problems, difficult problems, and not assuming that this is something the government needs to take care of. And then focusing on the long term. Those are all parts of our aspirations, assumptions, value systems that really need to change. In fact, one of the chapters by Rakesh Khurana says business schools have to fundamentally change. They have to become, instead of machines to teach you how to optimize the net present value or the profitability or the shareholder return, they need to become machines that teach you how to sit down, turn off the mechanical analysis, and reflect on why you're there, what you're trying to accomplish, and what you need to do to accomplish. And they shouldn't be graduating people from MBA programs who haven't had that experience. And in fact, it's going to take a huge change by faculty themselves to think differently about why the companies exist for whom they are training future leaders. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed, because I think if you take this slide seriously, there's really no way that human resources can say it's not my job, somebody else's job. And yet, you know, Ed's going to share some pretty sobering information about what is happening in HR. So, Terry, on to Ed.
Sue, before I launch in, I see we have one question there that you might want to deal with. I think you're better at answering this one than I am about conscious capitalism.
Yeah, I can't see the questions.
Oh, it says, help us understand the dialogue with conscious capitalism and joint participation in the national and local forums.
Yeah.
Conscious capitalism has always been a bit of a mystery to me in terms of, obviously I know that corporations have done it and they have an active group and so forth and so on, but I always have trouble putting them on the map, if you will, of organizations that are focused on what we call stewardship.
Well, conscious capitalism, of course, it's not an organization, it's a philosophy.
Well, there is a conscious capitalism organization, though.
Yeah, but there's lots of conscious capitalism kind of activities going on that are led by that perspective, and that organization exists to foster that perspective. And my view is that conscious capitalism is aiming at exactly what we're talking about with stewardship. The issue that I have about conscious capitalism is that there has been, either in the receiver of the message or in the purveyor of the message, a lot of what I think people interpret to be anti-corporate kind of rhetoric and perspective. And to me, the key issue is, do you or do you not believe that corporations are an effective way to organize the global economy and can change to support this broader set of outcomes? And my belief is that if you look at the world as we have it today, not the world as we would love it to be, but the world as we have it today, that I don't see how we can possibly do this without saying major players and major contributors are going to be corporations. And in fact, the ability to efficiently and effectively carry out economic roles is critical to our ability to do any of this, given where we are today. And in my belief, I believe that it's a fundamental building block no matter where you start. But the rhetoric of conscious capitalism, I have found corporations are put off by it, even though some of the activities of it, which are the collaborative, the co-definition, you know, the broader distribution of more equitable distribution of outcomes, all that, I think, are really the difficult problems we do have to grapple with.
So you think it goes further in that direction than
I don't think corporations are comfortable with the language of conscious capitalism.
Even though there's the Whole Foods of the world and so forth that profess to be following it.
Yeah, right. But in general. So I think it's done a huge service, and I think listening to what they say is really critical to moving forward. I think we have to do it in true partnership, not by saying the corporation has been a dysfunctional way of organizing for the world.
Yeah.
So that's a Sue Mohrman commentary on it.
Yeah, I have trouble placing them. That's part of why I asked you.
Yeah. Well,
I like some of the things that Whole Foods and some of the people that are in that conference group and that movement do, but I have yet to say where I really think conscious capitalism is the answer. You know.
It's a way of thinking, and I'm advocating all companies should think that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so
okay,
on
let me
HR.
look. I think HR should think that way as well. And there's really two legs on the role that HR might take, or two directions, one of which is certainly something that CEO has been involved in from the beginning of CEO, really, where we were very much into quality of work-life issues and how employees are treated, improving work and jobs, partly for financial returns in order to cut turnover, in order to improve motivation, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And we've continued to look at that, certainly, as a feature of most of our projects and most of our writing. We certainly believe that treating employees well within the corporation, paying them well, paying them equitably, giving them a piece of the action in the corporation is a win-win. It makes life better for them, and it potentially makes organizations more effective. The issue that has been sort of less a focus of CEO, but is certainly potentially a valuable thing that corporations can do and that HR can support, of course, is the connections to the community that are to some degree less separate from the day-to-day operations. Community groups, services, supporting inclusion outside the organization, arguing for societal change, engaging a whole workforce and serving society, the ERG groups, other kinds of groups which work actively to interface with the community and make the community better. Those are certainly interests of ours. We have activities, we have ERG group meetings now, and we are very much looking at that as a research area and as an action area. But I would say, at least for the history of the center, it's more evolutionary and not where we started. But under the stewardship brand, if you will, or label, we think that's very much inclusive, and it's very important for corporations to do. All of this raises the issue that we've had from the beginning, even when we were doing self-managing work teams and job enrichment and so forth, is what's HR's role in this? Well, we've asked that in some surveys. Can we go on to the next PowerPoint, please? And particularly in every 3-year survey we do of HR executives, just a few months ago published the most recent monograph on that, in which we reported our results from a couple of years ago. We're about to do a 16 version of that same survey, and we ask HR executives about sustainability. What activities are they taking part in? What are they dedicated to in the corporation? And the results are, I guess, disappointing is one way to say it. HR executives do believe consistently that HR should be actively supporting sustainability activities, that falls within their domain, if you will, of accountabilities and responsibilities and should-dos. The problem becomes when we start asking them, well, what do you do? What do you actively do to support sustainability initiatives, stewardship initiatives within your corporation? By and large, they say nothing. They don't particularly actively support it. It's not integrated into the HR activities. It's not something that people are praised or rewarded for doing, including the community outreach things, the environmental impact things. Basically, the data say that the HR systems and the HR function doesn't really operate with sustainability issues as a front and center important part of their mandate. I assume to some degree that's, of course, because they're not getting that kind of leadership from the CEO and from the other parts of the corporation saying you should take it on. And it does raise the whole issue of where does the sustainability function, if you will, or activities belong in a corporation. Who should head them? Should there be a head of them? How do they get integrated? And what our data so far at least say, there isn't a lot of clarity on that, and it doesn't seem to be something that HR is automatically at least, or even commonly, given responsibility for or made a part of its activities. Obviously, we think that would be a good thing for HR to have that responsibility and a chance for HR to align more what it does with sustainability issues, with the business strategy, but then again, it takes people in HR who have awareness and knowledge of the sustainability issues. Okay, let me stop there. Maybe go on. Sue, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just if you go back to the previous slide, just to make some things concrete. I mean, your slide with the data says that 50% of the companies aren't, HR isn't involved, but the other 50% are clearly doing something. And I thought that Phil Mervis's chapter...
Well, it's substantially less than 50, but that are doing something. But I agree, I should have mentioned that, I think Sue's about to. Phil in the chapter does a great job of showing the kind of activities that HR can sponsor that impact the community. Is that what you're going to say?
I was about to do. Yeah, go ahead and do it. I just didn't
no,
want to skip
fine.
over that.
Go ahead.
I didn't want to skip over that because I think it's unfair to say that HR isn't doing anything. I think 50% is higher than the study you and I originally did. So it obviously is changing. But I find particularly at the bottom under the purple thing, these are things that Phil talks about. His view is that for a long time HR has, by trying to promote internal practices that create interesting jobs and work advancement possibilities, et cetera, they have contributed to what you said we have always defined as sustainability, internal sustainability for members. And that, the nature of that has changed. So the green part is really the internal, so that there's been, I think, a lot of attention to work-life balance issues. Now, have the changes been effective? I think each company is, struggling with that, and you can tell by the popular press, not everybody believes that work-life balance programs actually are leading to greater balance. They might be, in some cases, seen as ways to give people flexibility so they can actually spend more time at work. But the piece that where Phil, I think, has really pushed the envelope is by saying that companies have a responsibility to be pillars of changing the life of people in the community, and that the people in the corporation, the employees, when they become involved in things like outreach programs and service learning around the world and working towards economic inclusion by starting to, let's say in the case of a computer company, sending teams of employees to work with kids in inner city schools and engaging the whole workforce and focusing the whole workforce through things like Patagonia's service days and so forth, and continually focusing the company that we're not here just for company results. We're here to really create a viable and contribute to a viable world, and that's all of our jobs, and we're in this together. I think there has been a tremendous amount of activity and success, and Phil cites companies such as IBM that send people for as long as key high potential managers, middle managers, for as long as 60 days to work in a developing country to try to help set up some kind of business model that helps the local people and is sustainable after they leave, things like that. The leaders, I think, are indeed leading the way. It's one of the reasons we wanted to write this book, was to say, what are the leaders doing that's leading the way? And I really see a momentum among HR in some population of the companies that are out there, but they're setting the examples of models that I think could have a great impact, and they're setting examples of concrete ways that HR can make a difference by fostering these kinds of development activities and stewardship-oriented activities.
And those issues, I think, those efforts are particularly interesting because they probably have a larger payoff for the society than for the company, but to some degree they also help with employees' Creating greater commitment to the company because it enabled it, perhaps learning skills and abilities that they wouldn't learn otherwise, getting a broader perspective, growing personally. So there is somewhat of a win-win there, but you take a scale of simply good for the company versus simply good for the corporations. For the society, they're probably more on the society side.
Short term. I think this is where I think the assumption of short term versus long term is really critical. Because if you say, does it help today's bottom line? Probably not. Does it help 5 years from now? Maybe, especially if it's strategically chosen. Does it help 10 or 15 years from now? Maybe. If many corporations can get involved in this kind of activity, we'll find very different communities for them to do business in.
And I guess the question inside a company is then who should take the lead in creating those? Is it really HR, or should they just be a supporter of general direction that the corporation takes? I think it's hard for them to do that in many cases as a sole operator. They do clearly need support from the rest of the organization, but they are in a particularly good position in many cases to support and make those things happen if they got support elsewhere.
Yeah, and if you really take the book to heart, nothing is single functional anymore. It's all functions working together. So if you're going to create a new product in a developing nation, HR can help create the team and the principles and the policies that allow people to go and spend time on that. But the decision about the product and what the team is and what the objective is locally probably isn't HR's to make, but they're probably part of the team that makes it.
We're just about the end of our time, and I'm looking to see if there are any questions that we have not answered. I don't see anything. It says one last comment is, inside the organization, it seems a crucial role for HR is promoting the use of evidence-based persuasion to influence values around the quadruple bottom line. And then it says, which I'm not familiar with, Cialdini's seminal work. Do you know that, Sue?
Denise Rousseau's work on evidence-based, management.
Yeah.
And I think I really agree with that. The whole premise of our work, which is to create these cases and make sure there are strong measures in all of our cases and look and try to do systematic learning across companies, is to create that evidence base. And I think evidence is persuasive. We really believe that and by the way, there are studies that prove that if you can get your executives to come to conferences and share with other companies what's going on, that seeing the evidence and hearing what they've been able to accomplish and hearing what impact that has had on their own organization, on retention, on how people think about their jobs, on building markets in new places, et cetera, is very, very compelling. And so building that evidence base, but also getting people in the company to really become aware of it is really a critical part of the transition.
Sue, do you want to sum up with any final comments? We're about out of time.
No, I think we've shared our main ideas. Thank you for joining us. This line of research has suffered from the exact same issue that Ed mentioned, which is it took us a long time to get our key sponsors of CEO interested in this topic. When we started in 2008, or 2006, I guess, was our first study, we had events and webinars, et cetera, and we had everybody but HR attending. HR would tell other people to come. And we're just really hoping through time that that's changing and that HR becomes a really, really strong advocate of making these kinds of changes in companies.
It would be nice to see the pace of change accelerate a bit.
Yep, it would. And if you're interested in our work and partnering with us, please reach out to us.
Thank you very much for attending and for your support as CEO. Remember, if there's anything we can do, give us a call.
Bye.
Thank you.